Master Wordlist. Words starting with letter E. Earthy means unrefined, coarse. For example, his earthy remarks often embarrassed the women in his audience. Ebb means recede, lessen. For example, sitting on the beach, Mrs. Dalloway watched the tide ebb. The waters receded, drawing away from her as she sat there all alone. Ebullient means showing excitement, overflowing with enthusiasm. For example, Amy's ebullient nature could not be repressed. She was always bubbling over with excitement. Eccentric means irregular, odd, whimsical, bizarre. For example, the comet veered dangerously close to the Earth in its eccentric orbit. Eccentricity means oddity, idiosyncrasy. For example, some of his friends tried to account for his rudeness to strangers as the eccentricity of genius. Ecclesiastic means pertaining to the church. For example, the minister donned his ecclesiastic garb and walked to the pulpit. Eclectic means composed of elements drawn from disparate sources. For example, his style of interior decoration was eclectic, bits and pieces of furnishings from widely divergent periods, strikingly juxtaposed to create a unique decor. Eclipse means darken, extinguish, surpass. For example, the new stock market high eclipsed the previous record set in 1995. Ecologist means a person concerned with living organisms. For example, the ecologist was concerned that the new dam would upset the natural balance of the creatures living in Glen Canyon. Economy means efficiency or conciseness in using something. For example, reading the epigrams of Pope, I admire the economy of his verse. In few words he conveys worlds of meaning. Ecstasy means rapture, joy, any overpowering emotion. For example, when Allison received her long-hoped-for letter of acceptance from Harvard, she was in ecstasy. Edict means decree, official command. For example, the emperor issued an edict decreeing that everyone should come see him model his magnificent new clothes. Edify means instruct, correct morally. For example, although his purpose was to edify and not to entertain his audience, many of his listeners were amused rather than enlightened. Eerie means weird. For example, in that eerie setting, it was easy to believe in ghosts and other supernatural beings. Efface means rub out. For example, the coin had been handled so many times that its state had been effaced. Effectual means able to produce a desired effect, valid. For example, medical researchers are concerned because of the development of drug-resistant strains of bacteria. Many once useful antibiotics are no longer effectual in curing bacterial infections. Effervescence means inner excitement. For example, nothing depressed Sue for long. Her natural effervescence soon reasserted itself. Efficacy means power to produce desired effect. For example, the efficacy of this drug depends on the regularity of the dosage. Effigy means dummy. For example, the mob showed its irritation by hanging the judge in effigy. Effrontery means shameless boldness. For example, she had the effrontery to insult the guest. Effusive means pouring forth, gushing. For example, her effusive manner of greeting her friends finally began to irritate them. Egoism means excessive interest in oneself. For example, his egoism prevented him from seeing the needs of his colleagues. Egotistical means excessively self-centered. For example, typical egotistical remark, but enough of this chit-chat about you and your little problems. Egregious means notorious, conspicuously bad or shocking. For example, she was an egregious liar. We all knew better than to believe a word she said. Egress means exit. For example, Barnum's sign to the Egress fooled many people who thought they were going to see an animal and instead found themselves in the street. Ejaculation means exclamation. For example, he could not repress an ejaculation of surprise when he heard the news. Elaboration means addition of details, intricacy. For example, tell what happened simply, without any elaboration. Elated means overjoyed, in high spirits. For example, grinning from ear to ear, Bonnie Blair was clearly elated by her 5th Olympic gold medal. Elegy means poem or song expressing lamentation. For example, on the death of Edward King, Milton composed the Elegy Licitious. Elicit means draw out by discussion. For example, the detectives tried to elicit where he had hidden his loot. Elixir means cure-all, something invigorating. For example, the news of her chance to go abroad acted on her like an elixir. Ellipsis means omission of words from a text. For example, sometimes an ellipsis can lead to a dangling modifier, as in the sentence once stressed, you should refrigerate the potato salad. Elliptical means oval, ambiguous. For example, an elliptical billiard ball wobbles because it is not perfectly round, an elliptical remark baffles because it is not perfectly clear. Eloquence means expressiveness, persuasive speech. For example, the crowds were stirred by Martin Luther King's eloquence. Elucidate means explain, enlighten. For example, he was called upon to elucidate the disputed points in his article. Elusive means evasive, baffling, hard to grasp. For example, trying to pin down exactly when the contractors would be finished remodeling the house, Nancy was frustrated by their elusive replies. Emaciated means thin and wasted. For example, his long period of starvation had left him emaciated. Emanate means issue forth. For example, a strong odor of sulfur emanated from the spring. Emancipate means set free. For example, at first,
The attempts of the abolitionists to emancipate the slaves were unpopular in New England as well as in the South. Embargo means ban on commerce or other activity. For example, as a result of the embargo, trade with the colonies was at a standstill. Embark means commence, begin a journey. For example, in devoting herself to the study of gorillas, Dian Fossey embarked on a course of action that was to cost her life. Embed means enclose, place in something. For example, tales of actual historical figures like King Alfred have become embedded in legends. Embellish means adorn, ornament. For example, the costume designer embellished the leading lady's ball gown with yards and yards of ribbon and lace. Embezzlement means stealing. For example, the bank teller confessed his embezzlement of the funds. Embody means personify, make concrete, incorporate. For example, cheering on his rival Mark McGwire's efforts to break Roger Maris's home run record, Sammy Sosa embodied the spirit of true sportsmanship. Embrace means hug, accept readily. For example, clasping Maid Marian in his arms, Robin Hood embraced her lovingly. Embroider means decorate with needlework. For example, for her mother's birthday, Beth embroidered a lovely design on a handkerchief. Embroil means throw into confusion, entangle. For example, he became embroiled in the heated discussion when he tried to arbitrate the dispute. Embryonic means undeveloped, rudimentary. For example, the evil of class and race hatred must be eliminated while it is still in an embryonic state, otherwise, it may grow to dangerous proportions. Emend means correct, correct by a critic. For example, the critic amended the book by selecting the passages which he thought most appropriate to the text. Emendation means correction of errors, improvement. For example, please initial all the emendations you have made in this contract. Eminent means high, lofty. For example, after his appointment to this eminent position, he seldom had time for his former friends. Emissary means agent, messenger. For example, the Secretary of State was sent as the President's special emissary to the Conference on Disarmament. Emollient means soothing or softening remedy. For example, the nurse applied an emollient to the inflamed area. Empathy means ability to identify with another's feelings, ideas. For example, what made in such a fine counselor was her empathy, her ability to put herself in her client's place and feel his emotions as if they were her own. Empirical means based on experience. For example, he distrusted hunches and intuitive flashes. He placed his reliance entirely on empirical data. Emulate means imitate, rival. For example, in a brief essay, describe a person you admire, someone whose virtues you would like to emulate. Enamored means in love. For example, Narcissus became enamored of his own beauty. Encipher
means encode, convert a message into code. For example, one of Bond's first lessons was how to encipher the messages he sent to Miss Moneypenny so that none of his other lady friends could decipher them.
Enclave
means territory enclosed within an alien land.
For example, the Vatican is an independent enclave in Italy. Encomium
means high praise, eulogy.
For example, uneasy with the encomiums expressed by his supporters, Tolkien felt unworthy of such high praise. Encompass means surround.
For example, although we were encompassed by enemy forces, we were cheerful for we were well stocked and could withstand a siege until our allies joined us.
Encroachment means gradual intrusion.
For example, the encroachment of the factories upon the neighborhood lowered the value of the real estate.
Encumber means burden.
For example, some people encumber themselves with too much luggage when they take short trips.
Endearment means fond statement.
For example, your gifts and endearments cannot make me forget your earlier insolence.
Endemic
means prevailing among a specific group of people. For example, this disease is endemic in this part of the world. More than 80% of the population are at one time or another affected by it.
Endorse means approve, support.
For example, everyone waited to see which one of the rival candidates for the city council the mayor would endorse.
Enduring means lasting, surviving.
For example, Keats believed in the enduring power of great art, which would outlast its creators' brief lives.
Energize
means invigorate, make forceful and active. For example, rather than exhausting Maggie, dancing energized her.
Enervate means weaken.
For example, she was slow to recover from her illness, even a short walk to the window would enervate her.
Enfranchise means to admit to the rights of citizenship.
For example, although blacks were enfranchised shortly after the Civil War, women did not receive the right to vote until 1920.
Engage
means attract, hire, pledge oneself. For example, your case has engaged my interest, my lord, said Holmes.
You may engage my services. Engaging
means charming, attractive.
For example, everyone liked Nancy's pleasant manners and engaging personality. Engender means cause, produce.
For example, to receive praise for real accomplishments engenders self-confidence in a child.
Engross means occupy fully.
For example, John was so engrossed in his studies that he did not hear his mother call.
Enhance means increase, improve. For example, you can enhance your chances of being admitted to the college of your choice by learning to write well. An excellent essay can enhance any application. Enigma means puzzle, mystery. For example, what do women want? Asked Dr. Sigmund Freud.
Their behavior was an enigma to him.
Enigmatic
means obscure, puzzling. For example, many have sought to fathom the enigmatic smile of the Mona Lisa. Enmity means ill will, hatred. For example, at Camp David, President Carter labored to bring an end to the enmity that prevented the peaceful coexistence of Egypt and Israel. Ennui means boredom. For example, the monotonous routine of hospital life induced a feeling of ennui that made him moody and irritable. Enormity means hugeness. For example, he did not realize the enormity of his crime until he saw what suffering he had caused. Enrapture means please intensely. For example, the audience was enraptured by the freshness of the voices and the excellent orchestration. Ensconce means settle comfortably. For example, now that their children were ensconced safely in the private school, the jet-setting parents decided to leave for Europe. Ensemble means group of players, organic unity. For example, as a dancer with the Oakland Ballet, Benjamin enjoyed being part of the ensemble. Entail means require, necessitate, involve. For example, building a college-level vocabulary will entail some work on your part. Enterprising means full of initiative. For example, by coming up with fresh ways to market the company's products, Mike proved himself to be an enterprising businessman. Enthrall means capture, enslave. For example, from the moment he saw her picture, he was enthralled by her beauty. Entice means lure, attract, tempt. For example, she always tried to entice her baby brother into mischief. Entitlement means right to benefits. For example, while Bill was entitled to use a company car while he worked for the firm, the company's lawyers questioned his entitlement to the vehicle once he'd quit his job. Entity means real being. For example, as soon as the Charter was adopted, the United Nations became an entity and had to be considered as a factor in world diplomacy. Entomology means study of insects. For example, Kent found entomology the most annoying part of his biology course. Studying insects bugged him. Entourage means group of attendants. For example, surrounded by the members of his entourage, the mayor hurried into City Hall, shouting a brusque no comment to the reporters lining the steps. Entrance means put under a spell, carry away with emotion. For example, shafts of sunlight on a wall could entrance her and leave her spellbound. Entreat means plead, ask earnestly. For example, she entreated her father to let her stay out till midnight. Entrepreneur means businessman, contractor. For example, opponents of our present tax program argue that it discourages entrepreneurs from trying new fields of business activity. Enumerate means list, mention one by one. For example, Huck hung his head in shame as Miss Watson enumerated his many flaws. Enunciate means speak distinctly. For example, stop mumbling. How will people understand you if you do not enunciate? Eon means long period of time. For example, it has taken eons for our civilization to develop. Ephemeral means short-lived, fleeting. For example, the mayfly is an ephemeral creature. Its adult life lasts little more than a day. Epic means long heroic poem or similar work of art. For example, Kurosawa's film Seven Samurai is an epic portraying the struggle of 7 warriors to destroy a band of robbers. Epicure means connoisseur of food and drink. For example, epicures frequent this restaurant because it features exotic wines and dishes. Epigram means witty thought or saying, usually short. For example, Poor Richard's epigrams made Benjamin Franklin famous. Epilogue means short speech at conclusion of dramatic work. For example, the audience was so disappointed in the play that many did not remain to hear the epilogue. Episodic means loosely connected, divided into incidents. For example, though he tried to follow the plot of Gravity's Rainbow, John found the novel too episodic. He enjoyed individual passages, but had trouble following the work as a whole. Epistolary means consisting of letters. For example, Mark Harris's Wake Up, Stupid is a modern epistolary novel that uses letters, telegrams, and newspaper clippings to tell the hero's story. Epitaph means inscription in memory of a dead person. For example, in his will, he dictated the epitaph he wanted placed on his tombstone. Epithet means word or phrase characteristically used to describe a person or thing. For example, so many kings of France were named Charles that you could tell them apart only by their epithets. Charles the Wise was someone far different from Charles the Fat. Epitome means perfect example or embodiment. For example, singing I am the very model of a modern Major General, in The Pirates of Penzance, Major General Stanley proclaimed himself the epitome of an officer and a gentleman. Epoch means period of time. For example, the glacial epoch lasted for thousands of years. Equable means tranquil, steady, uniform. For example, after the hot summers and cold winters of New England, he found the climate of the West Indies equable and pleasant. Equanimity means calmness of temperament, composure. For example, even the inevitable strains of caring for an ailing mother did not disturb BEA's equanimity. Equestrian means rider on horseback. For example, these paths in the park are reserved for equestrians and their steeds. Equilibrium means balance. For example, after the divorce, he needed some time to regain his equilibrium. Equine means resembling a horse. For example, his long, bony face had an equine look to it. Equinox means period of equal days and nights. For example, the vernal equinox is usually marked by heavy rainstorms. Equitable means fair, impartial. For example, I am seeking an equitable solution to this dispute, one that will be fair and acceptable to both sides. Equity means fairness, justice. For example, our courts guarantee equity to all. Equivocal means ambiguous, intentionally misleading. For example, rejecting the candidate's equivocal comments on tax reform, the reporters pressed him to state clearly where he stood on the issue. Equivocate means mislead, attempt to conceal the truth. For example, the audience saw through his attempts to equivocate on the subject under discussion and ridiculed his remarks. Erode means eat away. For example, the limestone was eroded by the dripping water until only a thin shell remained. Erotic means pertaining to passionate love. For example, the erotic passages in this novel should be removed as they are merely pornographic. Erratic means odd, unpredictable. For example, investors become anxious when the stock market appears erratic. Erroneous means mistaken, wrong. For example, I thought my answer was correct, but it was erroneous. Erudite means learned, scholarly. For example, though his fellow students thought him erudite, Paul knew he would have to spend many years in serious study before he could consider himself a scholar. Escapade means prank, flighty conduct. For example, the headmaster could not regard this latest escapade as a boyish joke and expelled the young man. Escapism means avoiding reality by diverting oneself with amusements. For example, before you criticize her constant reading as mere escapism, note how greatly her vocabulary has improved since she began spending her days buried in books. Eschew means avoid. For example, hoping to present himself to his girlfriend as a totally reformed character, he tried to eschew all the vices, especially chewing tobacco and drinking bathtub gin. Esoteric means hard to understand, known only to the chosen few. For example, the New Yorker's short stories often include esoteric allusions to obscure people and events. The implication is, if you are in the in crowd, you'll get the reference. If you come from Cleveland, you won't. Espionage means spying. For example, in order to maintain its power, the government developed a system of espionage that penetrated every household. Espouse means adopt, support. For example, she was always ready to espouse a worthy cause. Esteem means respect, value. For example, Jill esteemed Jack's taste in music, but she deplored his taste in clothes. Estranged means separated, alienated. For example, the estranged wife sought a divorce. Ethereal means light, heavenly, unusually refined. For example, in Shakespeare's The Tempest, the spirit Ariel is an ethereal creature, too airy and unearthly for our mortal world. Ethnic means relating to races. For example, intolerance between ethnic groups is deplorable and usually is based on lack of information. Ethos means underlying character of a culture, group, etc. For example, seeing how tenderly ordinary Spaniards treated her small daughter made author Barbara Kingsolver aware of how greatly children were valued in the Spanish ethos. Etymology means study of word parts. For example, a knowledge of etymology can help you on many English tests. If you know what the roots and prefixes mean, you can determine the meanings of unfamiliar words. Eulogy means expression of praise. For example, instead of delivering a spoken eulogy at Guinea's memorial service, Jeff sang a song he had written in her honor. Euphemism means mild expression in place of an unpleasant one. For example, the expression "he passed away" is a euphemism for "he died." Euphonious means pleasing in sound. For example, euphonious even when spoken, the Italian language is particularly pleasing to the ear when sung. Euphoria means feeling of great happiness and well-being. For example, delighted with her SAT scores, sure that the university would accept her, Allison was filled with euphoria. Evanescent means fleeting, vanishing. For example, Brandon's satisfaction in his new job was evanescent, for he immediately began to notice its many drawbacks. Evasive means not frank, eluding. For example, your evasive answers convinced the judge that you were withholding important evidence. Even-handed means impartial, fair. For example, do men and women receive even-handed treatment from their teachers, or, as recent studies suggest, do teachers pay more attention to male students than to females? Evince means show clearly. For example, when he tried to answer the questions, he evinced his ignorance of the subject matter. Evocative means tending to call up. For example, scent can be remarkably evocative. The aroma of pipe tobacco evokes the memory of my father. A whiff of talcum powder calls up images of my daughter as a child. Ewe means female sheep. For example, the flock of sheep was made up of dozens of ewes, together with only a handful of rams. Exacerbate means worsen, embitter. For example, the latest bombing exacerbated England's already existing bitterness against the IRA, causing the Prime Minister to break off the peace talks abruptly. Exacting means extremely demanding. For example, cleaning the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel was an exacting task, one that demanded extremely meticulous care on the part of the restorers. Exalt means raise in rank or dignity, praise. For example, the actor Alec Guinness was exalted to the rank of knighthood by the Queen. Exasperate means vex. For example, Johnny often exasperates his mother with his pranks. Exceptionable means objectionable. For example, do you find the punk rock band Green Day a highly exceptionable, thoroughly distasteful group, or do you think they are exceptionally talented performers? Excerpt means selected passage written. For example, the cinematic equivalent of an excerpt from a novel is a clip from a film. Excise means cut away, cut out. For example, when you excise the dead and dying limbs of a tree, you not only improve its appearance but also enhance its chances of bearing fruit. Exclaim means cry out suddenly. For example, Watson, Holmes exclaimed, seeing the assassin hurl himself on his friend. Excoriate means scold with biting harshness, strip the skin off. For example, seeing the holes in Bill's new pants, his mother furiously excoriated him for ruining his good clothes. Exculpate means clear from blame. For example, he was exculpated of the crime when the real criminal confessed. Execrable means very bad. For example, the anecdote was in such execrable taste that it revolted the audience. Execute means put into effect, carry out. For example, the choreographer wanted to see how well she could execute a pirouette. Exegesis means explanation, interpretation. For example, the minister based her sermon on her exegesis of a difficult passage from the book of Job. Exemplary means serving as a model, outstanding. For example, at commencement the dean praised Ellen for her exemplary behavior as class president. Exemplify means serve as an example of, embody. For example, for a generation of ballet-goers, Rudolf Nureyev exemplified the ideal of masculine grace. Exempt means not subject to a duty, obligation. For example, because of his flat feet, Foster was exempt from serving in the armed forces. Exertion means effort, expenditure of much physical work. For example, the exertion spent in unscrewing the rusty bolt left her exhausted. Exhaustive means thorough, comprehensive. For example, we have made an exhaustive study of all published SAT tests and are happy to share our research with you. Exhilarating means invigorating and refreshing, cheering. For example, though some of the hikers found tramping through the snow tiring, Jeffrey found the walk on the cold, crisp day exhilarating. Exhort means urge. For example, the evangelist exhorted all the sinners in his audience to reform. Exhume means dig out of the ground, remove from the grave. For example, could evidence that might identify the serial killer have been buried with his victim? To answer this question, the police asked the authorities for permission to exhume the victim's body. Exigency means urgent situation. For example, in this exigency, we must look for aid from our allies. Exodus means departure. For example, the exodus from the hot and stuffy city was particularly noticeable on Friday evenings. Exonerate means acquit, exculpate. For example, the defense team feverishly sought fresh evidence that might exonerate their client. Exorbitant means excessive. For example, the people grumbled at his exorbitant prices but paid them because he had a monopoly. Exorcise means drive out evil spirits. For example, by incantation and prayer, the medicine man sought to exorcise the evil spirits which had taken possession of the young warrior. Exotic means not native, strange. For example, because of his exotic headdress, he was followed in the streets by small children who laughed at his strange appearance. Expansive means outgoing and sociable, broad and extensive. For example, Mr. Fezziwig was in an expansive humor, cheerfully urging his guests to join in the Christmas feast. Expatriate means exile, someone who has withdrawn from his native land. For example, Henry James was an American expatriate who settled in England. Expedient means suitable, practical, politic. For example, a pragmatic politician, he was guided by what was expedient rather than by what was ethical. Expedite means hasten. For example, because we are on a tight schedule, we hope you will be able to expedite the delivery of our order. Expenditure means payment or expense, output. For example, when you are operating on an expense account, you must keep receipts for all your expenditures. Expertise means specialized knowledge, expert skill. For example, although she was knowledgeable in a number of fields, she was hired for her particular expertise in computer programming. Expiate means make amends for a sin. For example, he tried to expiate his crimes by a full confession to the authorities. Expletive means interjection, profane oath. For example, the sergeant's remarks were filled with expletives that offended the new recruits. Explicate means explain, interpret, clarify. For example, Harry Levin explicated James Joyce's often bewildering novels with such clarity that even Finnegan's Wake seemed comprehensible to his students. Explicit means totally clear, definite, outspoken. For example, don't just hint around that you're dissatisfied, be explicit about what's bugging you. Exploit means deed or action, particularly a brave deed. For example, Raoul Wallenberg was noted for his exploits in rescuing Jews from Hitler's forces. Exploit means make use of, sometimes unjustly. For example, Cesar Chavez fought attempts to exploit migrant farm workers in California. Expository means explanatory, serving to explain. For example, the manual that came with my VCR was no masterpiece of expository prose. Its explanations were so garbled that I couldn't even figure out how to rewind a tape. Exposure means particularly of being exposed, unmasking. For example, exposure to sun and wind had dried out her hair and weathered her face. Expropriate means take possession of. For example, he questioned the government's right to expropriate his land to create a wildlife preserve. Expunge means cancel, remove. For example, if you behave, I will expunge this notation from your record. Expurgate means clean, remove offensive parts of a book. For example, the editors felt that certain passages in the book had to be expurgated before it could be used in the classroom. Extant means still in existence. For example, although the book is out of print, some copies are still extant. Extent means degree, magnitude, scope. For example, what is the extent of the patient's injuries? If they are not too extensive, we can treat him on an outpatient basis. Extenuate means weaken, mitigate. For example, it is easier for us to extenuate our own shortcomings than those of others. Extol means praise, glorify. For example, the president extolled the astronauts, calling them the pioneers of the space age. Extort means wring from, get money by threats. For example, the blackmailer extorted money from his victim. Extradition means surrender of prisoner by one state to another. For example, the lawyers opposed the extradition of their client on the grounds that for more than 5 years he had been a model citizen. Extraneous means not essential, superfluous. For example, no wonder Ted can't think straight. His mind is so cluttered up with extraneous trivia, he can't concentrate on the essentials. Extrapolation means projection, conjecture. For example, based on their extrapolation from the results of the primaries on Super Tuesday, the networks predicted that Bob Dole would be the Republican candidate for the presidency. Extricate means free, disentangle. For example, icebreakers were needed to extricate the trapped whales from the icy floes that closed them in. Extrinsic means external, not essential, extraneous. For example, a critically acclaimed extrinsic feature of the Chrysler Building is its ornate spire. Extrovert means person interested mostly in external objects and actions. For example, a good salesman is usually an extrovert who likes to mingle with people. Extrude means force or push out. For example, much pressure is required to extrude these plastics. Exuberance means overflowing abundance, joyful enthusiasm. For example, I was bowled over by the exuberance of Amy's welcome. Exude means discharge, give forth. For example, we get maple syrup from the sap that exudes from the trees in early spring. Exult means rejoice. For example, we exulted when our team won the victory. End of the word list with words starting with letter E.